Okay, it's 4 o'clock. We'll get started. Thank you all for joining. And as other people come into the room, they'll get acclimated to the webinar. Today's webinar is called Preventative Maintenance in a World of New Regulations. What does that really mean? Well, before, years ago, when people would talk about preventative maintenance in buildings, particularly condominium associations, high rises, they would talk about, well, how frequently do I have to lubricate a pump? Or how many times a year should my cooling tower be cleaned? Things such as that having to deal with what we call MEP, mechanical engineering and plumbing. Unfortunately, due to the tragedy at Surfside, that has all changed. And what we're going to discuss today is preventative maintenance that's going to be needed to be done by associations in the world of the new regulations. And what do we mean by new regulations? We mean things such as the milestone inspections, such as the Sears reserve studies, things that are going to have to now become the requirement of boards to maintain and to keep records on. So without further ado, my name is Doug Weinstein. I'm Senior Vice President of Operations for AKAM Southeast. We are a property management firm that deals with luxury high-rise condominium associations, HOAs, as well as commercial. Joining me is one of South Florida's most renowned forensic engineers, who is intimately involved in a lot of the regulations that have been passed recently concerning buildings, concerning residential condominiums and residential buildings. Greg, thank you for joining me, Greg Batista. And if you could just give a little background of yourself before we get into the weeds here.
Great. First and foremost, I want to thank you, Doug and Giselle and AKAM for allowing me this time to spread the word. An important word, as you state, because these new regulations are daunting, and there's going to take a lot of professionals to make it turn out the way it's supposed to. My name is Greg Batista. I own G. Batista Engineering and Construction. I've owned this firm for about 20-something years already. I lost count, but I started out my career in construction. I worked for Turner Construction, building high rises as a project manager. I've built several high rises, and then I went off and did my own engineering company. I'm very unique in the industry because I've been at the very high level of doing construction, like in the trenches construction, and also being engineer of record for many buildings. I've also been on the board of Unsafe Structures, and it's sort of I'm very proud of the of how I've gone through the career, and I'm very well versed in both. So I again, thank you for allowing me this time to put this together. This is a very important topic, especially in the shadow of what happened at the tragedy over in Champlain Towers.
Right.
Now,
I think the best way to start, Greg, is let's give people a background on building basics. Okay, I think let's get into different types of buildings, different construction, that type of thing, to get everybody just online as to what we have down here in South Florida.
Well, right now, what we are talking about, this first slide, go back to the first slide. It's just an overview. There's 5 basic topics that we're going to be covering here. We're going to do the introductions, which we already did, and then we're going to go into the building basics, and then we're going to go into maybe the most important one, which is the top 3 issues in buildings, which comprise probably 80% of all the problems, and in my experience, I've seen in buildings and maintenance. Then how to avoid these problems and protect your property, and then we'll have a Q&A. I just want to say up front that I make my talks and my seminars very short, and I do that on purpose because I like to have people providing questions. And even as I'm talking, please go into the chat, provide your questions, or even if you have a story, Doug will be moderating. He'll be receiving the questions, and we can do them. I don't know if Doug, we can do it, as we go, or at the end.
We'll see what comes up. And I think if you could put it in the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen, and then I'll be monitoring that. And as we get in questions, we'll either ask them as we go through the discussion, or in the end, we will also have a dedicated Q&A session.
Perfect. So let's go on to the next slide. So building basics. I'm going to start off by talking about, the buildings are complicated by nature. And should you be worried about yours? I always like to talk about buildings as being like the human body. Like the structure is like your bones. That's what keeps you up. The electrical system is like your nervous system. And your skin is like the painting and the waterproofing. There's lots of ways that you can see that, but I like to explain it that way so people can understand that just as it is important to go to the doctor and get your general checkups and your dentist and stuff like that, that at the same time, you should, be cognizant of the fact that your building is like a human body and it takes maintenance and tender loving care for it to last. So should you be worried about your building? And there's two answers to that. There's yes and there's a no. And I'll tell you why for each one. Yes, you should be worried because as everybody knows, you've got problems that may be hiding underneath the surface that you don't know about. Buildings have what we call unforeseen conditions where you don't know about these things. And until an engineer comes in, like doing the 40-year certification, they won't find out about these things. And there might be other underlying safety concerns that may not be hidden, like grounding that's not properly placed, or the waterproofing system or the roofing system has failed. Now, should you be worried about your building? When I say that the answer is no, it's because you need to understand, and a lot of the people that are on this chat, on this seminar, that there's a lot of people involved. There's many layers of oversight that happens ever since the building is conceived. You've got the architects and the engineers that design the building. You've got the contractors that build it. You've got the building officials. You've got the fire department. You've got the health department. You've got property managers, which are professionals that know all these things. There's many layers, many different layers of people that are looking at your building that are well qualified to see if there's any issues there. Okay, so the next question is, why is it important to understand preventative maintenance? Preventative maintenance, I mean, it's again, I keep going back to this because it's so true. It's like your body, it's like your car. If you don't put oil in your car, if you don't wash it, you're going to get all sorts of problems. And if you don't change the brake fluid, guess what? You're going to have an accident down the road. And that's why at the very top of the list is that preventative maintenance is mostly is a safety concern, because if you don't paint your building, your concrete's going to fall, and the concrete's going to fall, and it's going to bang you on your head when it detaches from the substrate. You're going to have all sorts of issues that happen, electrical issues, frayed wiring that can electrocute somebody. So at the very top of the list, it's actually a safety concern, and there's other reasons why, but those are secondary. I want to concentrate more on the safety aspects. And then the second item says helps avoid future disasters and building issues. Now, I was involved in this whole thing with the Champlain Towers. I went to visit them in 2017, and I actually told them that they had a very bad concrete problem. It wasn't a waterproofing problem like they think they had. But these people, they just kicked the can down the road, and there's a whole story behind it. And actually, I wrote a book about it. You can get it for free on my website, askgbatista.com. And the basis of the book, it's about preventative maintenance, how important it is. That if a lot of people that are on these boards, they're not contractors, they're not engineers, and they perhaps don't need to be schooled and taught about the importance of this maintenance. And as property managers, I feel that it's sort of, your job also to impress upon them the importance of this preventative maintenance. Now, the other item is that it keeps the property up to code. Now, the codes, for those of you who don't know, these codes, the Florida Building Code is very, very detailed. And every 3 years, it's changed and it's updated. Now, we just started the next code, a 2023 code, just started in January, in this month. And that's made basically for safety. Again, it's safety. The Florida Building Code is there so that engineers and contractors, they can abide by these rules and regulations that are brought down legislatively, so that at the end of the day, it's a safety issue. So I don't know if anybody has any questions up till now before we go on to the next slide.
I think we can go proceed.
Okay. Now we're gonna talk about sorry about that. I lost my place. We're going to talk about the building basics.
The top three building issues.
Top three building issues. So in my experience, I've been 30 plus years working with buildings, and my niche is specifically working with existing buildings. Existing buildings is something that it's a lot harder to deal with an existing building as opposed to a new building where where the contractors and engineers have total control of what's going on. When you're working with an existing building, obviously you're going to have latent problems. You're going to have problems that are hidden. You're going to have, people running around inside the condominium. It's just a challenge overall in working with existing buildings. But in working with existing buildings, there's three major issues that I've seen in my experience where it takes up 80+% of all the problems that happen in a building. And let's start with the first one. The first one is concrete and structural problems. Now, my niche is working with existing buildings, particularly those buildings that are along the coast along the east coast of Florida and South Florida. So as you guys know, what problems do we have in the major structural problems that we have? We have something that's called spalling. And spalling is basically, it's a concrete that breaks. Now, why does the concrete break? The concrete breaks because you have a piece of reinforcing steel, and we call it rebar in the industry. You have a piece of steel that's inside the concrete. And when you have chlorides in the air and other types of components where it goes into the concrete. Now, concrete is basically porous. If you take a microscope and you look at the concrete, you'll see that it basically looks like a sponge. You can literally, if you were small enough, you can go from one end of the concrete, you can run through it to the other. So all these chlorides seep into the concrete through the rain, through just the moisture in the air. It gets to the reinforcing steel, and the reinforcing steel inside, it expands. And anybody that's seen any type of rust knows that rust just expands. And the rust on a piece of iron, it can expand up to 7 times its original volume. And of course, if you're going to have a piece of steel inside of concrete and it expands 7 times, you're going to get a rupture. It's going to happen. And I'm sure you guys have seen up and down the coast, those of you that work on these buildings have seen it. It's a major problem that's happening. And it's the basis of the problem that happened over in Champlain Towers. It wasn't dealt with in a timely manner. And that was the spark that just created a wavelength or a wave of an avalanche of consequential damages that happened afterwards. So the main issue with the structural degradation is this spalling. Okay, I don't know if anybody has questions on that, but if you have any questions, again, feel free to put it in the
Greg, we do have a question. And in the sense of this is, we're dealing with board members for the most part who, as you said before, are not technically proficient in building construction. When they walk around their building, or what should they be looking for as a sign of trouble in this first issue, which is the rusting and concrete spalling? When they see a crack, used to be, and I've been dealing with associations for decades, a lot of times before Champlain or before the new regulations, people would say, oh, we'll pick that up the next time we do concrete restoration or we do painting. Well, that's not a sufficient remedy anymore. Okay. These things have to be taken care of when you see them. And if you could just talk on what to look for and then why ignoring it or why not doing the preventative maintenance is not only going to cost you money down the road, but is also going to be more damaging to the property.
Great long question. I'll start that by saying that, soon after Champlain Towers collapsed, I received literally hundreds of phone calls of people saying, look, there's a small crack here, there's a small crack there, and people that were legitimately concerned. Now, as engineers, we can go somewhere and we can say, oh, that crack is nothing. But, I'd say that's maybe like a 50-50. 50% chance that it's nothing, it's okay, it's just a stress crack, or maybe it's a crack that's superficial. But the other 50%, at least in this area down here, is a spall. And a spall is just like it's like a cancer. And I like to explain it this way because a cancer grows. And if you leave a spall unrepaired, it'll just keep growing because the steel inside is growing. And you might see the concrete in perfect shape outside, but as it grows, you don't see it until it's too late, until a lot of the concrete keeps breaking. Just today, I was in a high rise in Hollywood, and they were asking me, this is a new client of mine, and they were asking me, hey, Greg, look at this crack here. And I said, look, that's a deflection crack, that's fine, but you have all these other issues over here. And, you know, I also saw that they had people who had gone in for the past 4 years. They had somebody, one of their maintenance guys, go in and just, you know, break out the part that's loose and just put some, I don't know what they put on there, and just hid, you know, what hit it. And let me just tell you, that is the worst. That is the absolute worst thing you can do. Because what happens is when you just cover it up without going through a certain, you know, engineering procedure to do it correctly, if you cover it up, what happens? You're covering up the damage that's continuing to grow underneath. So that repair that would have costed you $100 today, if you covered it up with some schmutz and you left it there for another 3 years, it's going to end up costing you $1,000 down the road. And that is, and a lot of people, you know, they don't know this because they're not engineers or contractors. But, you know, as property managers, I want to tell you this because I see this happen all the time. And I'm not saying that they want to get away with anything, because a lot of, you know, the vast majority of people on boards really want to do the right thing. They really care about their properties. But, you know, it's our job to let them know. So yes, so a stitch in time definitely saves 900 in this instance, because the rate of damage that happens is geometric. And by that, I mean that if it's going to take $100 to fix it today, next year it's going to be 300. And the year after that, it's going to be 900. So the rate of growth just grows geometrically.
And Greg, could you talk a moment just on, you know, and everybody, when they hear, oh, there's a problem with one of the walls in our building, there's cracks on it and things along those lines. And all of a sudden, people get very, very concerned in terms, oh, you know, we're going to have these huge costs. We're going to have, you know, all this scaffold drops and all of this other things. And one of the things if you could go in just for a moment, and with new technology, you as engineers are using different methods to look at these buildings. So, you know, if there is a crack on the building that's not, you know, floor accessible or ladder accessible, there are other ways where you can, and a lot of the engineers, and if you just talk a second on the capabilities of, say, you know, doing a drone inspection of a building, or doing something where you don't have to rig right away until you can get in there and see what's going on with maybe a drone camera or something along those lines.
Yeah, there's all sorts of ways that engineers can do to, you know, find out and get more clues, right? Because nobody has X-ray vision. So what we use is that we try to leverage the technology, you know, available to us as much as we can to try to get the best picture possible. Now, a lot of the times, you know, we're not infallible, and, you know, a lot of times we underestimate the concrete repairs. And if you guys have done any concrete repairs in the past, you know that these things have a nasty habit of going over budget just because we don't know. But we try to employ the best tools possible. For example, you mentioned drones. We didn't have drones 10, 20 years ago that were readily available, but everything everything has its pros and cons. A drone will actually let you go to levels where you didn't know, and the cameras have very good resolution. However, you're not there touching it and knocking on it and making and seeing how stable it is, or if there's any openings, to make sure that that's what you're looking at. Again, you get as many clues as you can, and one of the clues is with a drone. Another thing that has come up recently is GPR and X-rays. You can take a machine and basically look inside the concrete, okay? And with X-ray machines, and GPR stands for ground penetrating radar. There's companies out there that's all they do. However, those have their disadvantages. Those have their cons. For example, a GPR and an X-ray won't necessarily tell you the size of the reinforcing steel that's inside. You might have a big old number 8, but it might end up being a number 5. You can't tell. That's one of the limitations of that technology. Also, the technology doesn't tell you the state of deterioration that it's in. these machines basically just, the GPR especially, they just tell you what the density is of the different materials. And again, it comes down to what clues you can get from these, and then you can put all these clues together, and then that's where the engineer comes in, and his judgment, he can state, look, beyond, it's more reasonable than not that this is a major problem. And if more tests need to be done, there's other technologies out there. One of the technologies that I use is a golf club. I go up and you start knocking on stuff, because the sound that it makes to your trained ear, what's hollow, what's not hollow, if it's concrete, if it's a sound for just a stucco that's delaminated. So yeah.
Can you discuss, we've so far talked about, and I just wanted, before we move on to number 2, which is the moisture and water intrusion, I just want to give an idea. There may be some association board members or members that are on the call, on the webinar, that are in a newer building, okay, that's not necessarily a reinforced concrete building, but a PT or a post-tension building. Can you just talk a minute on the differences and what to look for in a PT building as opposed to what you've described on the reinforced concrete buildings?
Okay, just for those people who don't know, a post-tension building is basically a building that has a different kind of reinforcement inside. Now, when I spoke a few minutes ago about reinforcement, you basically have what we call the reinforcing steel. You've seen them, there's just a piece of round steel, and it just goes placed in the formwork prior to the people pouring the concrete inside of it. Now, the big difference is that you have what's called a post-tension cable. Post-tension cable is basically the same thing. It's a piece of steel, a piece of rebar. However, after it's been poured, after you pour the floor, let's say that this is your slab right here. You pour the slab, and you have inside, you have your pieces of steel, right? What happens is after it dries, after the concrete dries and hardens, you take a machine, you go on this side and you tie it to one end of the steel, and then you go to the other side and you tie it to one end of the steel. And what they do is they elongate it, and they put a great amount of tension on it. We're talking about 20,000 pounds of pressure. So basically what you have inside your concrete is a big old rubber band that's made of steel. And this is a very dangerous issue, because can you imagine if you had a huge rubber band inside your concrete that's been stretched to 20,000 pounds? Guess what? If you're hanging a ceiling fan and you're chipping you're chipping up above, and you happen to hit that rubber band that's already elongated to 20,000 pounds, what's going to happen? It's going to snap. And when that thing snaps, it breaks, and it can break the concrete, and it can even kill you in other, in extreme circumstances, because these things whip out, and it can cause a lot of bodily harm. So if you guys are working in a building, even these newer buildings where a lot of the slabs in these high rises use post-tension, and the reason post-tensions are used is that if you're going to do a high rise, a lot of engineers without post-tension, you're going to have 8-9-inch thick slabs, right? But if you employ post-tension, that will bring it down to maybe a 5-inch slab. That's why they're used. And they're used a lot because it saves the developer a lot of money. So if you guys have a newer building and there's concrete repairs that need to happen, put that at the top of your list, that whoever touches that building, whoever's going to do any repairs, that they know immediately that there's post-tension. And my experience is that when I go to these buildings and I say, I ask first, is this a post-tension building? A lot of them don't know. A lot of people don't know, and they don't even sometimes have even the plans that I would ask for. I said, well, I need to know. If I'm going to work on this building, I need to know. So it's very important, and thank you, Doug, for bringing that up. That's a very important component of.
You brought up a very good point. I just want to let everybody in on this. And one of the things you as board members in dealing with this, and Greg just talked about something very important, and it sounded a little bit, just off the cuff, someone chipping to put in a ceiling fan. Part of preventative maintenance for your structure of your building is going to be to ensure that residents who buy in and want to do renovations to their units are not doing anything that will affect either the concrete or the structural stability or the structural components of the building. So when you get a new owner who wants to, say, gut their apartment and do a bunch of renovations, it is incumbent upon you as boards, and we as managing agents recommend to our boards, that they have these plans without a doubt looked at by an engineer before you approve them or before you say, yes, the unit owner can go ahead with that. Just a point, it's very important, especially now with all the things that have come up, is to make sure that these renovations don't impact the building negatively.
Great. We can go on to the next one, the moisture and water intrusion.
Yes, I have one question that says, they were just talking a little bit about your idea with your tapping technique. I'm old school. I've also used chains, but we'll go with the golf club. You know, and is that also used? Can you identify things in concrete in the walls? You mentioned decks, you mentioned terrace, in the walls or in columns. And is that adequate to scope out potential loose items in those two areas? Or would you go for more of a destructive testing sort of protocol?
Well, when you're doing, at least in my company, we employ, you know, the use of the chains. The chains that you talk about is an actual ASTM actual test that a lot of people use. The golf club, we just use it, you know, to find out if there's, you know, typically issues that are, you know, that you just find anywhere you go. So you were asking about the.
Yeah, in terms of using walls and columns, can you also use the same techniques?
Yeah, because what you're basically, whether it's a wall, whether it's a column, whether it's a stem wall, a foundation, a beam, a concrete floor, it all exhibits the same type of behavior as far as a hollow sound and the size and shape of the crack that is formed. So it doesn't matter whether it's a wall or a column, a beam or whatnot. What happens is, what is the telltale sign is the actual sound that's made, whether you have a chain or a hammer, or, you know, some people like to use golf balls and they throw it at the thing, but it's the trained ear of the engineer. Now, I don't suppose that, you know, there's many engineers out there that are actually going to break out every single spall that they see, because you're going to end up with a building that looks like, you know, a Dalmatian. So no, so it's the sound that it makes, and it's regardless of whether it's on the wall or the floor or a stem wall or whatnot.
And you just brought up a very good point. And I just want to remind people that with your milestone inspection, which is an inspection of the structural elements of the building and these things that can affect the structural elements of the buildings. And we've talked about what is commonly done and what would commonly be done in a phase 1 milestone inspection. Now, because of what the engineer sees in that phase 1, there's another component to the milestone, which is a phase 2, where if the engineer sees things that are suspect and he wants to investigate further, that there are going to be potential destructive testing that's going to need to be done. So I just want to remind everybody that milestone can be elevated into a phase 2 if the engineer so decrees upon his initial inspection.
Right. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Doug.
No, I was just going to say it now. If we could go on to the second.
Well, let me just say something. You mentioned the milestone inspection, but I need to make a distinction between a milestone inspection and a building safety recertification.
Sure.
Milestone inspection is basically statewide, and it's a phase 1, phase 2, just like you said. However, we've been having 40-year recertifications in South Florida for a long time. And the 40-year recertification is much more involved. It includes electrical and things that the milestone doesn't necessarily include. So there's a lot of confusion out there as far as what the milestone, and we can have a whole other seminar on that, because there's a lot to unpack there. And, you know, I understand that there's a lot of confusion out there, and that's the reason I've written all these books. And again, you can get them at askgbatista.com, And all these books are free, okay? And I even did a book that's called Milestone Inspections and 40-year certifications, and you can download them for free because these are made specifically for property managers and building owners and people's on the board. It's written in very plain English. And, you know, and one of the reasons I do these seminars is to impart my knowledge, because once you do that and you read these books and these resources, you can show other people and you can tell them, look, go to the website. I've got all sorts of books on there. And again, they're made specifically for property managers and building owners and written in plain English. Okay, so let's go on to the second one. This is the second of the main building issues that comprise maybe 80% of the problems that I've personally seen in these buildings. And it's moisture and water intrusion. That is the bane of everybody's existence, because, you know, with all the rains and hurricanes that we have down here in South Florida, and the sun hitting these buildings, and the waterproofing cracks and the caulking joints that are on the windows, they break and they crack. You're going to get a lot of these problems, and these problems are big, not just because you get the water, but because of the secondary issues that happen after that. If you get water into a building, what happens? You get mold. What happens when you get mold? You can have, you know, adverse health effects. You're also going to get insects coming in, because some insects like to be with the water. So you need to understand that the typical places of the origins are the roof, expansion joints, windows, doors, vents, and through the paint itself. Now, water, as much experience that I have in this, I hate dealing with water, because oftentimes sometimes you see a leak on one side of the building, right? But where is the origin of the leak? It's coming through another side of the building. And it takes somebody with experience, so somebody that's knowledgeable, to be able, you know, whether it's a roofer, a waterproofing company, or a painter that deals with these kind of things. You have these professionals that are out there that are very, very well versed, that can get clues to tell you what the origins of these are. Now, we're going back to talk about preventative maintenance. I have a lot of buildings where they haven't painted in 20 years. And I know that it's a large expense for a lot of these buildings, but people do not realize, and the numbers prove this time and time again, that if you prolong the maintenance, it's going to end up costing you more in the long run. It's going to end up costing you more in the long run, as opposed to if you paint the building every 10 years or whatever your warranty is, and the type of paint that has been installed. And I think that if you take anything away from this seminar, any one nugget of knowledge is that people think that this preventative maintenance is a cost. Yes, it's a cost, but not doing it is a bigger cost.
And I think one of the things that people don't realize is that paint is actually a waterproofing.
Yes, some paints more than others. You know, some got some types of paint that has a larger warranty, that are elastomeric, that can stretch, and that they can, you know, withstand the harsh inclement weathers of you know, next to the ocean. And the people, your architects, your engineers, are the people who say, well, for that building, you need to use this type of paint, because, you know, you're going to get the cheap paint. Yeah, but you know what? It's not going to last as long as the other one. It's not going to, you know, waterproof your building as much as the other one. Again,
right. One of the things too, while we're on moisture and water, one of the things that I just want to bring up is that, you know, you mentioned roofs before, and very important structural component of your building. But also with roofs, think of roofs not only as the top of your penthouse level or on top of the first, you know, top floor of your building, but also if you have parking decks that are, you know, you have or an amenity deck that's over a garage or over another, you know, an inside area that's habitable. These are also what we consider roofs, and they face the same degradation and the same problems that the roof on top of your building faces. And now one of the things that we're seeing as managing agents, and a lot of you as association board members, I'm sure, are seeing this, is with the insurance crisis down here in South Florida, is that the insurers are looking a lot more closely at your building, and particularly roofs. They're looking at the age of your roof. They're looking at the condition of your roof. And I will tell you right now, every day it seems like we're getting declinations from carriers because of a roof. And one of the things that was in the past was people wanted to buy time. And as a preventative maintenance, it did buy you some time when you would do a recover of the roof. Okay, and it bought you whatever warranty you could get on that. But just as a word, and Greg, I'm sure you've seen this, is insurers are now saying that's not good enough anymore. When you have a roof that it's the end of its useful life or it's past its useful life, the idea of, hey, we can just recover it and get another 5 years is not flying.
Yes, I've seen it over and over again, and I've seen firsthand how insurance have more of a say and a hand in how you should, take care of your building. I mean, after all, if you don't take care of your building, that's money out of their pocket when some catastrophe happens. So, in one sense, I think it's great as an engineer. I think that it's wonderful, but as a fellow property owner / investor, it's not that good, because there's a lot of pain that's going to be coming down next year with all these SIRs and the requirements of having to spend the money that's actually in the reserves for those repairs. And I see up and down the coast, man, it pains me. A lot of people that live on Social Security on a single income, that they're going to be severely affected by all this. But at the end of the day, it's about the safety of the people.
And you brought up a good point, and we mentioned it in the beginning as one of the new regulations that have promulgated statewide is the SEERS. And I just want to make a point to association board members and other members that may be on the call, is that your SEERS is a moment in time. So it's when you do that report. So if you can get to stuff now and do preventative maintenance now and do repairs now before you theoretically have the SEERS, that's going to mean that that useful life of that component could potentially be extended, instead of, saying, oh, we'll cover it, down the road, when it could shorten the useful life, therefore forcing you, if it's a required SEERS component, of having a lot more contribution to your reserve fund. So a little bit of prevention now before your SEERS is finalized is not only going to go a long way to useful life, but it's also going to go a long way potentially to the amount of money that you're going to be required to reserve.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We've been doing a lot of SIRS reports, and those are some tough conversations that happen that occur with the boards and the property managers, that, it comes down to the money. And a lot of times, if you take care of that first stitch, and you don't have to include it as part of the forecast of expenditures that happen in the future.
Man, no, exactly. And I think one of the things, and let's go into electrical issues, but one of the things is you asked about stories, and I have a great one, is, I had walked into a building that we were going to be taking over in a few weeks. And I walked into an electrical room, a main switchgear room that happened to be underneath an amenity deck. And their idea of preventative maintenance was they had water leaking into that electrical room, and their idea of preventative maintenance was putting a piece of corrugated plastic over the switchgear so the water would fall on the floor, not on the switchgear. So that is not what we mean by preventative maintenance. So if you could go into a little bit about the electrical issues, because as you can know, water and electrical don't mix.
Yes, water and electrical definitely don't mix, and I've seen, I can put a book together of all the creepy things I've seen, incredible stuff that's out there. But again, I feel for people that want to do these repairs. Sometimes it's out of ignorance, sometimes it's out of, I just don't want to spend the money. But anyway, let's go back to electrical issues. Electrical issues happen because there's outdated electrical installations, especially on the older buildings that have outdated switchgear, outdated breakers. They're still using fuses and aluminum wiring. I can do a whole seminar on that, just on that. But and also a big thing is unpermitted work. You often see unpermitted work and people just taking taking a panel that's only supposed to be 12 breakers and changing the panel to a 42 breaker, and when the wire size is too small to support the loads. And, these are things that, people do a lot of times out of ignorance, and a lot of times out of they just don't want to call a licensed electricians and go through the pains of pulling a permit. But the permits are there for everybody's protection. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. Gianna, next slide. Okay, we've got what causes building issues. What causes building issues? Well, first and foremost, like we've been talking about since the very beginning, it's wear and tear. And a lot of it happens with the paint and the corrosion that occurs on the steel components, especially the rebar, like we were talking about, the electrical, plumbing, the personnel items. And what Doug was talking earlier about the MEPs. The MEPs, the mechanical, electrical, and the plumbing, those are items that are very susceptible to wear and tear because they have a lot of moving parts. You've got your alarm systems, you have your elevators, things that move and have motors. Those are components which are also very expensive to fix. If you don't maintain them, very expensive to fix. And the lack of maintenance, also the second item is delaying the process, ignorance, and lack of funding and indifference. Another thing that causes building issues is poor workmanship. We see a lot of the poor workmanship, like I mentioned before in the other a few minutes ago, where you're trying to repair concrete, but somebody just comes in and just does an actual concrete repair, a structural repair, by just removing the loose part and just putting some cement in. And the list goes on and on and on about poor workmanship. Also, there's bad design and bad construction. You actually have professionals out there who they just do bad work, whether by mistake or on purpose. And the other thing is the poor workmanship has to do with hiring unqualified professionals, which goes back to what I was just stating. There's people who call themselves handymen, and they do everything. Say, hey, can you do electrical? Yeah, I can do electrical. Hey, do you do tile? Yeah, we do tile. But they lack the knowledge that they need to actually go and pull a permit. Because the permit's there for several reasons. One of them being is that it ties you into having somebody at the building department look at it and giving you comments and making sure that it complies with the Florida Building Code. Because like I said before, the Florida Building Code at the end of the day is about safety. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. How to avoid building issues. Now, a lot of times when, especially after the Champlain Towers collapse, a lot of people just panicked. There's many things that go into place to ensure construction goes smoothly, such as permits, building department reviews, general contractors, engineer of record, special inspections, and threshold inspectors, and the city inspectors. Just know that there's a lot of professionals out there. And a lot of times your first professional is your property manager. That person is in the trenches. They know the building more than the vast majority of the people that are there. And they're the go-between between what's going on in the building and their Rolodex of professionals that they have out there. They know when to call an architect as opposed to when to call an engineer. They know when to call an electrician instead of calling an electrical engineer, right? So it's about hiring the right professional, and all the professionals are out there. Another thing is when buying, you hire the right professionals. Again, when you're going to buy a property, now this may not have to do a whole lot with property management, but again, there's a whole slew of professionals that are out there that on every level. They make sure that when you're buying, that you're covered. You've got your contractors, attorneys, insurance agents, or real estate agents. The next is you avoid building issues by having a proper reserve study. Now, the laws have changed. Now you have the structural integrity reserve study. You can do a whole seminar. The next book that I'm writing is about doing a SIRS for Florida. But the reserve study is a whole other chapter within of itself. And as you guys know, it's just a matter of setting that money aside and complying with the current law so that you spend that money wisely. And instead of putting new carpet and new, a new pool and new chairs, that you're actually employing that money to do things for the longevity of your building, such as the structural and electrical items. And how to avoid building issues, you also have prior inspections, you have the fire, you've got fire inspections, you've got the elevator people that come in and they inspect the elevators. You've got all sorts of inspections that happen. You've got the city inspectors. And then the last one is how to avoid building issues is you have your inspections. Right now, we call them 40-year recertifications. They're not called 40-year recertifications anymore. They're called building safety recertifications, depending on if you're in Dade or in Broward. But I think that there's a great utility with these inspections. And I know that a lot of times I get on the phone with a lot of these people. They're saying, oh man, they cost too much. And, why do we have to do this? And, I always explain to them, at the end of the day, it's about your safety. It's about your safety. So I think we're at the end, right? The last one is questions and answers.
Speaking of the 40-year certification, before we have a question in the chat, and the question is, someone writes from Boca Raton, their building is in Boca, they just did a 30-year study, and they're asking, does that overlap with the milestone requirement of SB 154? And I believe you should talk with your Boca Raton building official, because there is a proviso in 154 that will let a recertification or a 30 or 40-year study take the place of a milestone if it includes the components required in the milestone. Am I correct on that, Greg?
Yes, a 40-year recertification with all the forms and everything is probably 20 pages long, and it's very detailed, as opposed to a milestone inspection, which has some very basic properties to it. So easily the milestone, the 40-year recertification, whether it's a 30-year or 25-year recertification, is a lot more involved and a lot more detailed. So I can see that yes, excuse me, it would take the place of a milestone. But again, it all comes down to where, where this is. Basically in South Florida, you're going to have the 40-year recertifications. You don't need to do a milestone. But outside of South Florida, depending on what the building official wants to push, it's the milestone is going to be required.
Right. But again, just and this question was from Boca Raton, I would just check with the Boca Raton building department, and they will obviously let you know whether they would accept that in lieu of the milestone.
Correct.
Couple other questions. One we have is there a way to find out if our building is post-tension?
The surest way to find out is look at your plans, or have an engineer look at the plans, because there's typically no outward signs that a building is actually post-tension. You can't look at the outside of the building and say, oh, it's post-tension. So you need to look at the plans. And if you don't have plans at the building, which is very typical, then you would go to the building department and ask them to see a set of plans. And this is something that I highly recommend for you property managers out there. It is of such utility that whenever you get an engineer to go out there, or a contractor, or somebody that's doing something that may seem innocuous, to have the plans available. And we've got the technology right now that you can have the plans in PDF, you can post it online, it is of such utility. You have no idea how hard it is sometimes and how expensive it is for us to, like, if somebody tells me, no, we don't know if there's post-tension, then you know what? We need to get a GPR out there and spend $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 to check the floor to see if there's post-tension, because nobody's going to take a chipping hammer to a floor on a high rise unless that is found out first. And that's just one example of many. So another little nugget of knowledge is that if you guys have a building where you don't have your plans, take some time to get the plans, put them on a PDF, and have them there for your future professionals.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I mean, I've walked into buildings where, there's a garbage bag full of old water-stained plans. If they do exist, but they're in bad condition, see if they're even in a condition where you can have them digitized, instead of leaving them in the bag. Another question we had is, what is the useful life of a new roof for a building? 20 years, et cetera. or less as some insurers are pushing for. What would be your basic, and I know it depends on what roofing system and different components on that, but what is a typical, I know a typical is a bad word here, but
Well, you have to make a distinction between warranty and useful life, right?
Right.
Because, your warranty is whatever your warranty is. Because if you buy a standing seam roof, you might get a 50-year warranty on a standing seam roof. However, if you got your cheap asphalt shingles, you might get a 10-year warranty. Okay. So after 10 years, if it fails or whatever, you're up the creek and you can't do anything about it. Now that's different. I could have a shingle roof that I take care of, that there's no hurricanes, that there's no water, and then that it ages very gracefully. So that roof can last me 20 years. And at the end, at 10 years, I can look at it, I can check it out, and I can say, well, it hasn't achieved the end of its useful life. So it depends on many things. It depends on how well it's taken care of. It depends on how much it's been battered by the elements. It depends on the type of roof. And there's a lot of different roofs out there that have different levels of, like, for example, ponding. You have what's called a TPO roof, which basically you can have ponding water on it, and it won't affect the warranty, and it'll be okay. But the vast majority of other roofs, you have ponding water on it, forget it. It's the useful life of that particular roofing system is going to go down the drain. So that is a very complicated question. It's a good question, but it's a complicated question to answer.
One of the things, just to tag on to that question, is one of the most important things to an association when they're replacing their roof is, and unfortunately, I see it kind of put to the side a lot of times, is you're going to get, as Greg mentioned, you're going to get a warranty on your roof. And depending upon what type of roofing system, it may be 15, 20, 25 years, all the way up and even above that. Take a look at what your requirements are to keep that warranty in full force and effect. Because one of the requirements in every roof warranty that I've dealt with is that you have a roof maintenance program. Okay, and that requires the roof to be inspected X number of times a year by a certified roofing installer that handles that particular type of system. And you keep records of that and you do your repairs. The easiest thing for a roofing manufacturer is to come in and say, well, sorry, the warranty's no good because you didn't do A, B, and C. So it's very important that you know your warranty and know what you have to do as an association to keep that warranty in full force and effect. Let's talk, another question that we had talking about window replacement. And one of the things, it was separation between Sears windows and unit owner windows that have reached the end of the useful life. And I think, Greg, before you go into it, maybe from an engineering standpoint, one of the things that was clarified in SB 154 is that the Sears handles components that are the responsibility of the association. So you need to check your association docs as to what those, let's take a unit owner window. Is it the responsibility of the unit owner, or is it the responsibility of the association? And that's going to really go into whether it's considered a Sears component or not. The common area windows, in any event, are going to be considered a Sears component. But in terms of the unit owner windows, that's really going to be clarified through your docs. And one of the things that we would recommend, if you're unsure of that, ask your association counsel on that, and to have them tell you where it is. And then also your Sears engineer, and I'll let Greg answer this, as a Sears, as someone who does these, do you look at the docs? Do you look at, what do you look at to determine?
Well, first and foremost, if you look at the law, it actually states the minimum requirements for items that need to be included, and they're actually stated line by line. So we take it by that. And also, in addition to that, you have components that affect the structure in one way or another that whose replacement cost exceeds $10,000. So all those items we look at and we put them in the report. So it's pretty straightforward.
Right. Well, Greg, I want to thank you. Our time has come to an end for today's webinar. I think we've had some phenomenal takeaways from this. And again, if there's something, and I'll ask Greg for a few closing remarks, if there's something that you really need to focus on in your building going forward, is this preventative maintenance. And like in the beginning, we said not just the mechanical stuff, but the structural stuff. And life has changed for associations ever since the tragedy at Champlain. Okay. And you need to make sure as boards that you take your responsibility seriously and to maintain your building. Greg, closing remarks?
The only one thing that sticks in my mind is that preventative maintenance is an investment, period. It's not an expense. It's an investment. If you think about it as such, you should be good.
And Greg, I want to remind everybody, as Greg has mentioned, his website, if you could give that again, Greg, I would appreciate it.
Is it backwards, or do I need to turn it around?
No, it's good.
Okay, it's askgbatista.com. As you can see, it's my brand. I like people to ask me questions. That's why I put Ask G Batista. I love doing these things. I love imparting knowledge and having people make their places safer for the residents and owners. But
Greg,
thank you again, AKAM, for having me.
Greg, I want to thank you very much. Your insight is always valuable. And to everybody, thank you for joining us this afternoon. Greg's email is on the screen right now. And as we said in the beginning, this is being recorded, and we will be sending it out to all participants shortly with a link that you'll be able to reference it or share it with your fellow board members or association members. Again, on behalf of AKAM, thank you so much and have a good rest of the day.